Hello Internet, so nice to see you. Some months ago a student asked me why we call some intervals like fourths and fifths perfect, and why we call some other intervals like thirds and sixths and second and sevenths major and minor. Well, the answer accepted today is that, first of all, it's just a name. Second is because there are two versions of, say, the thirds, major third and minor third, while there is only one version of the fifth, which is not really true since we have the augmented fifth and the diminished fifth, but let's gloss over that for a moment. And another reason is because perfect intervals tend to be more consonant than other intervals, so fifths, fourths, and octaves tend to be much more consonant, so we want to give them a different name. That's the answer I gave him, but honestly, there was this little voice inside me telling me, no, this is not the actual answer. A few months later, I was reading an Italian Baroque manuscript, and I discovered, to my utter surprise, that they were talking about major fifths and minor fifths. Oh my, if today somebody said major fifth on YouTube, that person will be crucified in minutes by a horde of YouTube trolls. So what was happening there? Why they were calling fifths major and minor, and later I found also there were major and minor fourths. What was happening there? Well, that's interesting because in Baroque music you actually have two versions of the fifth and two versions of the fourths. The major fifth is what today we could call the perfect fifth, and the minor fifth will be the diminished fifth. And for the fourth, what today we call the perfect fourth will be a minor fourth, and what today we call an augmented fourth will be a major fourth. This actually makes a lot of sense, and understanding why they were calling intervals this way and how we got to change to our current names really clarifies a lot about the inner work of music. So let's see what's happening here. Let's put ourselves in the mind of a Baroque musician. We're going to have the major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. I'm going to write it in C because everybody knows that. And we have, of course, other notes in between those notes. And let me write on top how many half steps there are between the first note C and all the other. So if you look at it this way, it's very easy to number the notes of the scale, meaning the C is the first, the D is the second, the E is the third, and so on and so forth. And if we compare these with a minor scale, you see that, for instance, the third, sixth, and seventh exist in two versions. So it's very easy to group those and call one of them the major third and one of them the minor third. One of them the major sixth, one the minor. One of them the major seven, one the minor. That's fantastic. What about the other intervals? Well, the second is the same for both major and minor, but it still makes sense to call one of them major second and the other minor second because they have pretty much the same pattern as the other. The fourth and fifth are a bit more complex because, you see, they seem to overlap because thinking like a Baroque musician, they were using the triton, the note in between the fourth and the fifth often, and sometimes they were getting this triton by taking an interval of a fifth and lowering the top note, and sometimes by taking the interval of a fourth and raising the top note. So they really wanted to distinguish those two situations. They really wanted to be clear on which one of the two was happening, because in Baroque music it's important to know, because it changes the way you resolve the dissonance. The G flat will resolve down and the F sharp will resolve up. This, by the way, is still true in music today, though, of course, we can break this rule anytime we want, and they could break this rule anytime they wanted, but they just wanted to be clear on that. So they were thinking of the fourth and fifth as overlapping. The G and G flat would be major and minor fifth, with the higher one being called major, and F and F sharp were still major and minor fourth, with the higher one being called major. So far, so good. Now notice that this system has a very pleasant property. If you want to invert an interval, you just subtract the interval from 9 and invert major and minor. What do I mean with that? Well, let's take a major third, C to E. If rather than thinking C to E, which is a major third, I'm thinking E to the next note, C, I will have a different interval. To know what is this interval, I need to take the number 9, take out 3 because the original interval was a third, so I get a sixth, and then invert major and minor. So the original was a major third, the inversion is a minor sixth. And this is true everywhere. So the inversion of a major second is a minor 7, the inversion of a minor second is a major 7, and so on and so forth. And notice that the inversion of a major fifth is a minor fourth, and the inversion of a minor fifth is a major fourth. Everything works perfectly. It makes perfect sense. And that went on for all the 18th century. Then, somewhere in the 19th century, they decided that they didn't like this naming system anymore. Now, the exact reason, that's difficult to find. I've been reading a lot of original books from the 18th century and the 19th century, and nobody ever explains to you why they're doing things and why they change the names. But I think I got a good idea on what was going in their mind. One of the things they didn't like is that the fourths and fifths were overlapping, while none of the other intervals is overlapping. The other problem is that both major third and minor third are consonant, and both major sixth and minor sixth are consonant. Both major 7 and minor 7 are dissonant, and both major second and minor second are dissonant. But for fourth and fifth, this doesn't happen. The major fifth is consonant, the minor fifth is very dissonant. The minor fourth is consonant and the major fourth is very dissonant, and that's kind of a mismatch that people really didn't like. So they set out to find a different system, and the idea was, well, let's call those perfect. Now, this did not happen from one day to another. There was a lot of trial and error, a lot of academic discussion. You can trace lots of scathing letters from one theorist to another because one was obviously right, one was obviously wrong. But eventually, they landed on the system we have today. How is our system different? Well, we divide the intervals in flexible and inflexible. The flexible interval are second, third, sixth, and seventh that exist in both major and minor version, but they can also exist in augmented and diminished version. If you expand the interval another step from major, you get an augmented interval. If you shrink it from minor, you get a diminished interval. So, for instance, you can have a diminished seventh, which is B double flat, which is, yes, enharmonically the same as A, but formally a different one. And then we have the inflexible intervals that have only one version, the perfect one, but then you can still create augmented and diminished version. If you go from perfect and expand the interval 1/2 step, you get an augmented interval, and if you shrink it from perfect by 1/2 step, you get the diminished interval. So now the G will be the perfect fifth, the G flat will be a diminished fifth, and the G sharp, an harmonical equivalent to an A flat, will be an augmented fifth. Now this new system still allows to invert intervals using the rule of 9, so I can still subtract the interval from 9, and now though major invert to minor, minor invert to major, perfect invert to perfect, diminish invert to augmented, and augmented invert to diminish. So if, for instance, if I have a diminished fifth, 9 minus 5 is 4, and diminish invert to augmented, so now I have an augmented fourth. So see, the new system works perfectly too, pun completely intended. It's just different than the one before. If I were to look at both those systems with fresh eyes and forget for a moment that I was taught the modern system, and so if you say major fifth to me, I have a fit of rage for you labeling things incorrectly like the worst troll on YouTube, well, looking at them with fresh eyes, the original Baroque system was actually easier to learn because you had only two things to learn, major and minor. And you could still think about augmented or diminished interval if you wanted, in specific case like the augmented sixth chord, which happens occasionally, actually pretty often in Baroque music. But it was easier and in this sense more coherent, more, if you want, more adapted to the human mind, because you just have two versions of every interval, period. But the modern system is more mathematically correct, and it also more perceptually correct because the fifth and the fourth do sound different than the other intervals, and you cannot just say that what we call today the perfect fifth and the diminished fifth are just major and minor version of the same intervals. Those two notes, those two intervals, sound radically different. One is extremely consonant, one is extremely dissonant, much more than the difference between, say, major and minor third and major and minor seventh. So the modern system recognizes that we do perceive those intervals differently, and it clarifies it directly in the name. perfect, major, or minor. At the end of the day, though, both systems work perfectly well. Both systems allow people to make music, and it's pretty much an aesthetic choice. I will not advocate going back to the Baroque method when everybody today uses the modern method. I mean, that would be just confusing. And then again, you will run the risk to occasionally say things like major fourth, and then everybody will stab you with their pointy guitars. But that's the real story of why we call some interval perfect and some other intervals major and minor. And I know you guys at this point are waiting for me to give you the moral of the story. But in real life, often stories don't really have a moral. Except maybe that the system is not that important, as long as you can make music with it and you understand the sounds behind the name, so that the major third is not just the major third, but it's these. And if you understand that, then you have everything you need. This is Tommaso Zillia of musictheoryforguitar.com, and until next time, enjoy.